Chapter 2. Solera Tani, the Betrayal. The Nova Queen descended through Caldramor's atmosphere, fierce winds from a snow-laden blizzard battering the Corsair from port to starboard for long minutes before delivering her to the frozen wasteland below. "I hate this planet," muttered Fropan, a bald-headed man hunched in the pilot's chair, huge and muscular, yet perpetually sweating even in the ship's frigid cabin. "Steady as she goes, Fropan," said the tall Tamal standing behind him, arms crossed over his chest. Storm-touched amber eyes never left the viewports as the man they called Starhawk watched the white expanse roll beneath them. "Not many worlds will exchange stolen goods for clean credits, no questions asked," Hawk reminded his pilot. "Aye, sir," Fropan muttered under his breath, his massive knuckles white against the controls. The ship glided over snow-packed plains that stretched to the horizon, weaving between towering glaciers and skirting the edges of ice-blue crevasses that plunged into darkness. Ahead, small dark specks moved across the white expanse, local Dremorian snow nomads. They crawled on their bellies up a snowbank, approaching a herd of Hoda buck from their blind spot with the patience that meant survival on this unforgiving world. Fropan banked the Queen downward toward the hunters, flying over the scene far lower than was prudent, his engines scattering the startled herd in all directions. Fropan's laughter filled the cockpit. "Fropan!" Hawk's voice cracked like a whip. "What in the void was that?" "Just having a little fun with the ice natives," Fropan said between chuckles, clearly pleased with himself. That may have been their only chance for meat in weeks. The words carried the weight of someone who understood what hunger meant, what it was to watch your people go without. For a Tamal who had grown up respecting the hunt and the balance of survival, the casual cruelty struck deep. "Why would you do that?" "Because I can," Fropan snapped back, his humor evaporating into indignation. "They'll live," he muttered under his breath, rolling his massive shoulders as if shrugging off an unwelcome burden. Finally, they approached their destination, a massive opening in the ice sheet, perfectly circular and descending into the planet's depths like a wound carved by nature's own hand. This core vent had formed millennia ago when superheated rock, driven upward by the relentless pressure of Caldramor's molten heart, had burst through layers of cooling stone and ice. The eruption had been brief but violent, leaving behind a natural chimney that descended through kilometers of frozen strata to the geothermal chambers below. Dozens of such vents dotted the planet's surface, ancient scars from the world's violent birth, but few remained as accessible or hospitable as this one. Petra Core, as the locals had named it, was one of the few places on this death world where warmth still lived. The ship began its slow descent into the core vent, and rather than growing darker as they sank deeper into the planet's heart, the cavern blazed with artificial light. Landing platforms jutted from the walls like metal shelves, connected to small trading communities that disappeared into rock-carved warrens. Smaller ships and transports darted through the vertical space like insects, carrying goods, treasures, resources, and contraband between the docked vessels and the platforms that served as makeshift ports. Inside the Queen's cockpit, a figure stepped silently behind Hawk and Fropan. "Gentlemen," came a woman's voice, smooth as Alderanian wine and twice as dangerous. "Time to get paid." Solera Tani, captain of the Nova Queen, was a woman whose natural beauty couldn't be hidden beneath the dirt and grime that came with a pirate's life, constantly running from the law or pursuing the next score. Her scarlet longcoat, trimmed in dark gold, accentuated rather than concealed a figure that would have drawn appreciative stares from any cantina in the galaxy, had she not also worn a vibroblade and DL-44 heavy blaster pistol on her hips like promises of violence. Solera caught Hawk's eye and nodded toward the corridor. Her first blade stepped close and leaned into her whisper. "Keep an eye out. We'll get a new crew as soon as we're paid." Hawk's amber eyes flicked once toward Fropan before he gave an almost imperceptible nod. He slipped past his captain with the fluid grace of his people and headed toward the cargo bay as Fropan guided the ship onto a small platform outlined with blinking landing lights. Fropan pushed himself out of the pilot's seat with a grunt and squeezed his bulk sideways past Solera, close enough that she could smell the perpetual sweat that clung to him despite the ship's recycled air. "Captain," he said, the word carrying just enough respect to avoid insubordination, while his smile promised exactly the opposite. Soon, Solera's 12-person crew was busy transferring their latest haul onto repulsor carts. Jek, a grizzled Corellian whose cybernetic arm could crush Durasteel, supervised the loading, while Zara, a blue-skinned Twi'lek whose leku bore the ritual scars of a former gladiator, counted inventory with mechanical precision. Near the cargo ramp, Voss, a young human whose baby face belied his talent for slicing security systems, kept watch with nervous energy. Across the platform, Solera and her first blade stood deep in conversation with a man whose thick black beard couldn't hide the calculating gleam in his eyes. Over glasses of genuine Corellian whiskey, they laughed, spoke in serious undertones, then laughed again. Finally, the bearded man shook both their hands and strode toward a massive vault guarded by no fewer than 15 scoundrels, mercenaries, pirates, and bounty hunters, the kind of security that spoke to serious credits changing hands. "I'll be back," Hawk told Solera, his voice serious, with a sense of immediate duty. Hawk pocketed a handful of credits, samples the big bearded man had given them to verify his payment wasn't counterfeit, and made his way to the marketplace, a cramped warren of stalls carved into the cavern walls where desperate merchants hawked everything from military-grade rations to stolen medical supplies and hunted and butchered meats. He rented a snowspeeder from a foul-smelling Rhodian who asked no questions, then acquired the kind of cold-weather gear that meant the difference between life and death on Caldramor's surface. Borbor pelts still reeking of musk and torn fur, thick enough to turn a blaster bolt. The repulsor lift carried him to the surface like a mechanical prayer, rising through layers of ice and stone toward the killing cold above. Wind-carved ice formations loomed like skeletal fingers as Hawk's speeder cut through drifts that could swallow a man whole. The tracks left by the hunting party were already filling with fresh snow, but Hawk's amber eyes, trained from childhood to read the subtlest signs, followed the fading trail across the wasteland. He found their refuge where the land folded in on itself, a snowbank that concealed the mouth of a natural cavern. This was survival at its most basic, finding the one place on a death world where warmth still lived. Hawk shouldered 2 heavy packs and descended into darkness. The microshaft wound downward like a throat, carrying the promise of geothermal heat that had drawn the nomads here generations ago. 2 guards emerged from alcoves carved into the walls, their weapons crude but effective, the kind of modifications that came from necessity rather than choice. "I have a gift," Hawk said in the universal language of peace. The guards led him deeper to where the shaft opened into a more vertical descent. Steam rose from the depths, carrying with it the scent of sulfur and life. Hawk shed his outer jacket as the hydro-lift carried him down, the primitive mechanism groaning with each meter of descent. The walls grew brighter as they approached the village below, not from technology, but from the natural phosphorescence of mineral deposits that had been exposed to geothermal activity for millennia, supplemented by cooking fires and the glow from small molten pools that provided both warmth and light. The settlement was larger than he'd expected, but still heartbreakingly small. Perhaps 50 fighting men, maybe 120 souls total when you counted the women and children whose survival depended on every successful hunt. They had adapted to their harsh world with the kind of pragmatic ingenuity that spoke of generations spent balancing on the knife's edge between life and death. Heated by the geothermal pools and vents, most wore vests of scraped hide painted in vibrant colours, yellows and reds and blues extracted from the stones and minerals that were their only wealth. A lean man approached, his bearing marking him as someone who had earned respect through more than just age. The staff in his weathered hands was carved with symbols that told stories Hawk could only guess at. "I am Semak Hatuakath," Hawk said, using the formal cadence of tribal introduction. Starhawk was what he was called in the common tongue of the sector, hawk that flies to the stars in Tamal. "I come with this offering to atone for disturbing your hunt." He paused, letting the words settle before speaking the ritual phrase that bound all who understood the old ways. "The hunt is sacred." The nomads' voices rose as one. "The hunt is sacred." "The hunt provides life," Hawk continued. "The hunt provides life," they echoed. "The hunt is life." "The hunt is life," they all repeated. As their voices faded, Hawk unwrapped his heavy packs to reveal the hindquarters of 2 Hoda buck, meat that represented weeks of sustenance for these people, purchased with credits that meant nothing compared to the protein that would keep children alive through the next storm. He laid the offering before the tribal leader and knelt, feeling the man's calloused hand settle on his bowed head like a benediction. "Mayatar," the leader declared, a word that carried the weight of acceptance, forgiveness, and the bonds that connected all living things. The crowd took up the chant, "Mayatar, Mayatar, Mayatar." Hawk sat with the men around their communal fire, sharing a ritual portion of the meat he had brought, while their voices rose in songs that predated star travel. The music spoke of hunts both successful and failed, of loved ones lost to the ice, of the endless struggle to carve meaning from a universe that seemed determined to grind them to dust. It was the kind of evening that reminded him why some things were worth fighting for, and others worth dying for. Back aboard the Nova Queen, Captain Solera waited in the common area when her crew returned from their labours. The pirates were loud and rowdy, already drunk on the anticipation of spending their shares on the Corps' cheaper pleasures. Pleasures that would help them forget, at least temporarily, what they had become. "Here's your share," Solera said, sliding an open case across the table toward Fropan. Fropan's expression shifted like weather patterns over a storm-racked world. The satisfied grin that had lingered since their successful score faded, transforming into something far more dangerous. This was the moment every crew leader dreaded, when the arithmetic of loyalty failed to balance against the weight of greed. "This is less than we agreed upon," Fropan snarled, his small eyes fixing on Solera with the intensity of a targeting computer acquiring lock. "This was always the deal, Fropan. Half for the crew, half for those in need, plus ship supplies and repairs." "We're the ones in need," Jack shouted, his cybernetic arm whirring with agitation. "Let the needy fend for themselves," Voss added, his youthful face twisted with the kind of casual cruelty that came from too many years watching others suffer. "They have a point," Fropan said, his massive frame shifting forward like a predator preparing to strike. Solera had seen this dance before, the moment when a crew's loyalty became a commodity to be bought and sold. She had 2 choices, fight and die, or live to fight another day. The mathematics were simple, even if the decision tasted like ashes. "Okay," she said, her voice carrying the weight of strategic retreat. "You win. Take it all." She lifted the second case and slid it across the table into the waiting hands of Zara and Voss. "Happy?" Solera asked. "Not quite," Fropan said, his blaster now tracking lazily between her and the door. "Move." Solera understood the game now. This wasn't about credits. It was about power, and the kind of men who confused the two rarely stopped at simple theft. Several crew members surrounded her, their hands rough as they secured her arms. Solera herself was no stranger to violence. Her blade had tasted blood on a dozen worlds, and her blaster had ended more lives than she cared to count. But plasma bolts traveled faster than even her reflexes, and courage meant nothing when faced with the simple mathematics of firepower. 12 blasters against 1 life. The odds were as clear as vacuum, and just as unforgiving. "To the cargo hold," Fropan barked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally claimed what he thought was his. When Hawk returned, the ship felt different, the way a home feels when strangers have been going through your belongings. He made his way to the cockpit, where Fropan sat with unusual casualness in the pilot's chair, wearing the kind of grin that spoke of secrets and schemes. "Where's the captain?" Hawk asked, though something in the air already whispered the answer. "She's in the cargo hold. Wanted to speak with you before we blast off," Fropan said, his tone carrying just enough truth to be believable. Still warm from his time with the nomads, and if he was honest, still feeling the effects of their potent ritual drink, Hawk made his way aft. But the moment he entered the cargo hold, the last of the alcohol burned away in a rush of cold clarity. Solera sat on a maintenance bench, wrists and ankles secured in energy binders that would deliver a painful shock if she tried to break free. 4 crew members, including Voss, Zara, and Jek, formed a semicircle around her like judges at a trial where the verdict had already been decided. Hawk took a step toward them, every muscle in his frame coiling with barely restrained violence. "You ungrateful nerf herders." The whisper of metal against leather cut through his words as blasters appeared in their hands, like deadly flowers blooming in the ship's recycled air. Hawk was a warrior forged in the crucible of tribal warfare, his reflexes honed by years of combat against both beast and man. In hand-to-hand combat, he could have carved through the lot of them like a thermal detonator through tissue paper. Solera's eyes found his across the space, a look that carried years of partnership and trust, speaking louder than words. "Not here. Not now. Not like this." "If we left you alive," Fropan said from behind, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing weather patterns, "you'd hunt us down. No doubt about that." The kick to Hawk's back sent him stumbling toward the bench, his warrior's balance the only thing keeping him upright. Pain flared along his spine, not enough to disable, just enough to make a point. "But why kill?" Fropan continued, his logic as cold as the vacuum between stars. "When you can profit." 2 pairs of energy binders skittered across the deck plating, coming to rest at Hawk's feet like metal serpents. The message was clear: compliance or death, and death would be neither quick nor clean. Hawk's hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he secured the binders around his wrists and ankles. "Now sit tight," Fropan said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had finally claimed his prize. "We're headed for the blood circles. Between the 2 of you, we'll have enough credits to buy our own ship." He paused, then winked at Solera with the kind of casual cruelty that spoke to something fundamentally broken in his soul. "If we didn't already have yours." Fropan's laughter echoed off the cargo hold's walls as he and the others filed out, leaving their former captain and first blade alone with their chains and their rage. "They'll pay," Hawk whispered, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had never forgotten a debt. "Every last one of them will pay for this." "I know," Solera said simply. In the silence that followed, neither spoke of what the blood circles meant, the gladiatorial pits where desperate souls fought for the entertainment of those rich enough to bet on their lives. Neither mentioned the statistics, that fewer than 1 in 10 fighters lived long enough to buy their freedom. Some truths were too heavy for words, especially when those words might be among the last they ever shared. But in the darkness of the cargo hold, with energy binders cutting into their wrists and the ship's engines humming their journey toward an uncertain fate, something else passed between them. The kind of understanding that came from years of watching each other's backs in the void's darkest corners. The blood circles had claimed countless victims over the centuries, but they had never faced 2 people who had learned to survive by making the galaxy's worst nightmares into someone else's problem. Fropan and his crew thought they were delivering lambs to slaughter.
They had no idea they were about to unleash wolves.